Hey folks, welcome to my Weird Background Commanders deck building challenge. 2 weeks ago, I gave the following prompt to my Discord server. Build a deck using one of the Choose a Background commanders you see on screen now, partnered with a background of the person's choosing. There were a lot of decks this time around. Doing a first pass through by myself worked fine last time, so I figured I'd do that again this time, and it took a while. It's fine, I had a lovely time looking through 400 decks. The judging criteria were creativity, cohesion, and likelihood to produce dynamic gameplay. The first two were the main two. I wanted to see decks that were cool, interesting, and unique in some way, and I wanted to see decks where the command zone and all other major elements of the deck felt cohesively tied together into a unified and functioning package. There's nothing majorly wrong with a cohesive deck that's a little bland, or a funky deck that's a little all over the place, but in this challenge I was looking for the confluence between these two features. After I had done the first pass-through on the decks, I discussed the ones that stood out with me the most with my co-host on the Magic Mirror podcast, 33 Elk, and my IRL friend, Hans, and picked out a winner for each of the 5 commanders based on their input. So, this video will be showcasing those decks, and touching briefly on honorable mentions for each commander as well. Those honorable mentions will be featured in their own tab on my website, linked in the description. Also, I'll be showing some fun charts for these commanders as well, compiled by people in my Discord server. Shoutouts to Jack and a garbage bag of human teeth for going to the effort of putting that together. Without further ado, the first commander option was Alora, Merry Thief, a 3-mana 3/2 with the text, whenever you attack, up to one target attacking creature can't be blocked this turn. Return that creature to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. This is an interesting card because bouncing a creature at end of turn is generally a significant downside for most decks, and not worth the benefit of giving that creature unblockable. This commander had the most submissions at around 100, and people tackled this in a variety of different ways. Some used ball lightning style cards that would otherwise sack at end of turn, some used ninjas, a lot used Alora as a way to recycle ETBs, some were initiative decks, and a couple paired Alora with Cultists of the Absolute and some haste equipments in order to avoid needing to sacrifice a creature on upkeep. As you can see on this plot, Izzet Alora decks were the most popular, with Dimir Alora following closely behind. For a few honorable mentions, we have a deck based around the card Dawn of the Dead, a deck that focuses on the card Ether Vial as a way to help with getting creatures back into play, and a spell-less Spellslinger deck. That one is a funny one, and it was a favorite among people on my Discord server. For the winning deck, though, we have a returning winner. Filthy Stacks players submitted a sneak attack deck, with Guild Artisan chosen as the partnered background. Now, the choice to run sneak attack wasn't a unique one for this challenge. Getting creatures out at a discount to be sacrificed at end of turn makes sense as a way to utilize Alora, and was a reasonably popular choice as a result. However, this deck had a handful of construction choices that made it stand out above the rest of the crowd. For one, its utilization of its background. Guild Artisan wasn't a wildly popular background in the challenge, but it could be a nice treasure engine. More importantly though, this deck pairs it with polymorph effects. That's right, this deck can tutor out a sneak attack effect via one of 2 cards that remove a permanent to grab one of the same type, doing so by polymorphing its own background, which is conveniently castable from the command zone. This can also work with the treasures produced by Guild Artisan to polymorph for artifacts, since Chaotic Transformation can target multiple permanent types, and Reality Scramble can be cast multiple times via Retrace. These are supplemented with a handful of tutors that combine instants and sorceries, enabling the deck to have consistent access to its key enchantments. One natural question for a sneak attack deck is, what is being snuck out? In this case, there's a total of 16 creatures of mana value 6 or greater, a pretty robust number. Among these, some number are your typical cheat deck beaters, such as Ancient Stone Idol and Cityscape Leveler, but past these, there are some more interesting ones. Balefire Dragon provides a source of large-scale removal. Nullspine Dragon can allow for some big draw with creative turn ordering, and there are also a number of ETB creatures that can get value turn over turn utilizing sneak attack, and these include Tyrant of Discord, Astral Dragon, and Trumpeting Carnosaur. There's also another key top-end creature, Nezahal, and that one can serve as a gesture to a key sub-theme within this deck, Flicker. Flicker cards perform 2 functions here. As with the commander, they can recycle ETB creatures, and they can also flicker a creature put out with sneak attack to keep it around permanently at no additional expense. This gives the deck a great degree of flexibility in how hard it wants to commit to the board, and in how much it wants to grind value. There's also a good amount of redundancy in key types of effect. There are 4 total cards that can perform a sneak attack-like role, 2 enchantments, and 2 non-enchantment cards that are similar enough, and there are likewise multiple alternative options for keeping around sneak attacked creatures outside of the command zone. Overall, this is a super cool deck. Great job again, Filthy Stacks player. Next up, we have Amber Grisolo Maul, a 4-mana 3/3 with haste, and whenever this creature attacks, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw a card for each player being attacked. Naturally, this encourages a lot of low-slung, scrappy strategies, and this was a commander where an impressive portion of the decks were budget decks. All of my top picks here were less than $150, some a lot less than that. As you can see from the plot here, black was a very dominant choice for a background color among Amber decks, which makes sense given her self-discard oriented gameplay. For a few honorable mentions, we've got a Pump Spells Voltron deck, a budget aggro deck, and a Reanimator deck. For the number one Amber deck though, we've got Lord Reverend's Clerics and Dwarves deck, with Haunted One as the partnered background. Really, this deck focuses on one specific variety of creature, that being clerics and dwarves that sacrifice creatures to accomplish tasks. We've got 11 of these, along with 12 other clerics and 5 other dwarves. The basic idea here seems simple. Dump these creatures into play alongside Amber and Haunted One, and then swing in with Amber in order to both wheel and use sacrifice abilities on the now undying clerics and dwarves. This can produce effects such as destroying a creature with Blind Zealot, tutoring out black creatures with Shadowrite Priest, and drawing cards with Skullport Merchant. The deck also contains 5 cards that reanimate in some way, including 3 attached to a cleric, as well as 3 Madness cards, so there's some degree of synergy present to work with Amber's attack trigger. Her power and toughness aren't great, only 3/3 on a 4-mana creature, but this doesn't matter as long as the deck has Haunted One in play. This might prompt a follow-up question. What if you want to sacrifice a creature that already has a +1/+1 counter on it? The solution to this potential issue comes in the form of a handful of cards that remove counters from creatures. There are 9 of these total, and while most of these feel more like filler than anything else, the 2 enchantments seem great. Ion Storm provides a quality source of repeatable burn damage, and Retribution of the Ancients is an even more potent tool, particularly when the deck's board gets bigger. The other standout element of this deck is its suite of board wipes. The deck runs an eye-watering 9 board wipes, which the deck can break parity on through Haunted One. One of these 9 is Yocklehops, which can provide a game-warping nuke once the pilot of this deck trusts their board to run to the finish line. These board wipes seem like an appropriate tool to help the deck's honestly mediocre creatures get around the large boards of modern-day EDH decks. Because that's the most palpable vibe this deck gives off, the jank factor. The cards here are, at best, normally mediocre cards being used in their narrow use case window of being decent, and in some cases, mediocre cards even in this deck. We've got late 90s dwarves, various mediocre commons from across the years, Grimwire of the Dead. There's so much nonsense here, united in flavor or function or both. This feels appropriate, though, for a few reasons. Amber is a fundamentally janky commander. She's a draw engine, but one that requires playing in a very scrappy style, and one who doesn't even reward that style that heavily. Her 2 creature types, Cleric and Dwarf, are not generally great ones to build around. Clerics have gotten just enough love to make Shadowborn Apostle decks look a quarter of the way respectable, but dwarves? Yeah, no, forget about it. In addition, this deck's budget is quite low. It's sitting below the $50 mark if you exclude Haunted One, a card which, as Lord Reverend alluded to, is basically free as long as you win this competition, since the prize card is an altered art version of the card. A wildly polished deck with top-tier card quality, this certainly is not, nor was it intended to be. As a final note, this deck also has an undeniable thematic core to it. We have themes of death and dying riddled throughout this deck, including the Haunted One background, a whole lot of cultist-type creatures that sacrifice things to perform rituals, and board wipes that represent great dying-off events. Lore-wise, Amber herself is a cleric with connections to the Shadowfell, carrying a certain degree of liminality with her, tugged between life and what lies beyond. This further helps the deck in communicating itself as a cohesive unit, and the end result has an undeniable sense of style to it. Next, let's talk about our white commander option, Ellyn Harbury's Busybody. She's a 4-mana 2/4 creature with tap, look at the top X cards of your library where X is the number of tokens you created this turn. Put one of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. People took this base in a variety of different directions, but there were 2 main patterns. One were decks that create tokens and also really want a source of filtering, an example of which might be a combo deck or some sort of synergy-hungry machine sort of deck. The other type of deck people built were decks specifically interested in maximizing the level of dig they could get out of Ellyn, either through creating a lot of tokens or by untapping her. As you can see from the pie chart, most of the decks featured either black or green, though this was not the case for our honorable mentions here. These were 3 blue-white decks, a deck built around flyers and the card Mirrorweave, a Haper's deck with a lot of draw denial effects, and a Twiddlestorm deck built around cards like Talrand Sky Summoner. However, the winning deck was a different sort of Twiddlestorm deck, Atris 159's Bellringer deck, with Agent of the Iron Throne chosen as the background. This is a deck focused on effects that untap all of your creatures. 4 of these untap all creatures on opposing untap steps, 8 untap all creatures once, and a few other cards untap creatures more selectively. To go along with these, this deck has 8 creatures that tap to create a token, 7 that tap to add mana, and 2 cards that tap to create treasures, effectively doing both of these things. Once this deck has Ellyn and some of these effects online, it can start to do some cool stuff. The deck can use all tap abilities, creating mana and tokens and filtering, and then it can play a card that untaps all creatures to refresh all these tappers. Mana creators let the deck avoid running out of mana too fast, and creating tokens allows the deck to dig deeper and deeper with Ellyn on each round of tapping, hopefully finding additional untapping effects for as long as the Ellyn player wants to keep going. The deck doesn't have an explicit win con in the 98 outside of maybe Halo Fountain, but the elegant thing here is that the deck doesn't really need a specific payoff card for a big tapping and untapping turn. Agent of the Iron Throne in the command zone means that a board full of tokens already contains an implied level of damage, and several Ellyn activations will mean a well-curated hand of cards when passing after a big turn. To go along with the rest of this game plan, the deck also contains a handful of one-time token producers, some protection for the commander, and a small suite of other support cards. What's interesting about this deck is that I think both Agent of the Iron Throne and Haunted One work well as backgrounds, though they lend very different play patterns for finishing off opponents. Agent of the Iron Throne gives the deck a more measured playstyle that focuses on optimizing twiddle turns in the moment and worrying about finishing the game later once a whole lot of tokens are in play. Haunted One, on the other hand, is more explosive, rewarding careful planning and avoiding opposing hate with the potential for some truly disgusting alpha strikes. Either way seems valid to me, though something nice about Haunted One is that it also gives the deck a bit of something that it's a bit low on at the moment: protection. Ellyn can tap herself at any time she's untapped to grant the benefit of Haunted One, even if no tokens were created during a turn, which gives a pretty sweet tool for dealing with removal. This is relevant because the deck's strategy, and its access to a Blood Artist effect, depend on Ellyn being in play, and Ellyn getting single target removed can pose a meaningful setback for the deck. This issue is somewhat counterbalanced, though, by this deck's high density of ramp and inclusion of recovery cards, such as Dazzling Theater and Wand of the World Soul, which can help the deck in getting Ellyn back out to the board rather than stalling out. So, this is more of an idea to play around with than any sort of major critique. Overall, this deck is well-built, dynamic, and unique. Great job, Atris 159. Next up, let's talk about Viconia, Drow Apostate. She's a 3-mana 2/3 whose text reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, return a creature card at random from your graveyard to your hand. On the surface, this card is similar to an enchantment called Oversold Cemetery, with one key distinction: the returned creature is chosen at random. This immediately causes some problems with the use cases of the card, because if you throw a bunch of filler creatures into your graveyard, plus a desirable key creature or 2, you're probably going to get back garbage off of Viconia, or at least that's the most likely outcome per trigger. Naturally, there were a mixture of different solutions players found to this issue. Some chose to have most creatures be functionally identical, or chose synergy packages where getting back any creature was beneficial regardless of what it was. From this chart, you can see that the colors were more spread out with Viconia than with most of the other commanders, though green was still the most popular. For a few honorable mentions, there was an Umori companioned Golgari midrange deck, a modular creatures deck, and an Astral Slide deck. For the winning deck, we have a different cycling deck, Chimes' high mana value cycling deck, with Tavern Brawler as the background commander. This was the one winning deck that 3/3 Elk dissented on, though they did note that from a lore standpoint, having Viconia drunkenly fighting people is very funny. As you might guess from the description of the deck I gave, the foundation of this deck lies upon one simple fact: there are a lot of 5 to 6 mana creatures with some form of cycling or other. This deck contains 13 each of generic cycling creatures and land cycling creatures, plus an additional 3 channel creatures which can be discarded for an effect. This means that the deck has a pretty easy time getting creatures in the graveyard for purposes of getting Viconia's ability online. In addition, all of these land cycling creatures can basically exist in place of a land, so that significantly lowers the number of lands that need to go in the deck. The other thing that can help with this is MDFC lands, at least in the sense that they allow the deck to contain more cards whose front side is not a land. This is important for purposes of Tavern Brawler, since hitting a land with the card doesn't buff Viconia. As a result of its 13 land cycling creatures and its 11 MDFC lands, the deck's official land count, excluding MDFCs, is 14. My mana base tool does rate this deck's mana base as very strong after plugging in some appropriate discounts, and I'm inclined to agree with that analysis, though with the caveat that there will be lands entering tapped and turns spent land cycling. The end product of this is that the deck has an exceptionally high average card cost of 4.3, and that's including lands. This means that the deck is likely going to be able to push a decent amount of damage with a Tavern Brawling Viconia. There are a handful of evasion cards to help with this, as well as a decent suite of removal to clear out blockers and push an opponent into unfavorable blocks. The other thing accomplished by the command zone is that it contains 2 different value engines, which can allow the deck to maintain a solid baseline of gameplay volume, even if there are some setbacks. Finally, the deck has a handful of other cards which can take advantage of its high average mana value, in addition to Tavern Brawler. As it stands now, this deck is a funky mid-range battlecruiser brew with some fun side paths. However, more so than being a perfectly conceived final deck, I like this as a deck that has a lot of good ideas and comfortably dips its toes into a lot of different archetypes. A deck whose elements gesture to a variety of different directions it could be further honed. More ramp could amplify the battlecruiser side of it. More reanimation spells could amplify the explosive creature sheathing side of it. More evasion could amplify the Voltron elements of this deck. More discard or other resource attacking methods could amplify the grindy aspects of this deck, and so on. It's also very budget at the moment, and it could either be kept that way or upgraded with a handful of more powerful cards. Good stuff. Finally, let's talk about our green commander option. Halsin, Emerald Archdruid is a 4-mana 2/4 with the ability to pay 1 mana to turn a token into a 4/4 green bear until end of turn. This is a great ability in terms of raw rate. Like, those tokens were probably something like base power 1/1 if they were creatures, so that's a +3/+3 for 1 mana, and if they weren't creatures before, that's a whole different degree of value. However, despite having a lot of potential, Halsin also presents a handful of questions. What tokens should he be animating? And what should be done with a bunch of 4/4s? There were some creative answers to these questions among the submissions. As you can see on this plot, blue and white were quite dominant as the second colors, constituting around a third of decks each. For a few honorable mentions, there was a deck that animated auras to generate sack triggers off of Martyr's Bond, a Power Stones deck, and a Tokens Enchantress deck that used Opalescence to get an additional copy of the background bonus. For the winning deck, we have QBCCL's Incubate deck, with Inspiring Leader used as the background. Incubate is an unusual mechanic introduced in March of the Machine that creates artifact tokens with +1/+1 counters on them, and these tokens can later be transformed into 0/0 creatures for 2 mana. This has some very clear upsides paired with Halsin's ability. For one, we get all the benefits of the +1/+1 counters on the tokens without needing to pay the 2 mana to flip them, instead paying 1 mana to get them for a turn with an additional +4/+4 on top. Secondly, the fact that these tokens don't need to be flipped makes them more resilient. Instead of exploding to either an artifact wipe or a creature wipe, these tokens will generally die only to artifact wipes, since they're typically not creatures on our opponent's turns. They also don't even have to be creatures on our turn. This deck runs a number of board wipes, which have the potential to be kind of one-sided, with the deck storing power and toughness in its Incubate tokens. The deck contains 12 total cards that create Incubator tokens, and with their relative permanence in mind, it also runs a number of cards that can proliferate the +1/+1 counters on them, gradually ramping up the size of these tokens turn over turn. There are also 8 other cards in the deck that use counters in some way, which is good, as it means that the proliferate cards are going to be getting value outside of the incubators, which is good, as there aren't that many of them due to them only being in one set. Likewise, many of these cards that use counters also create tokens, with this deck containing a total of 17 other token-creating cards outside of the Incubate cards, which is good, as the deck's main plan for winning is animating things with Halsin and swinging in with them. The background is here to amplify that plan, boosting the 4/4 bears up to 6/6 bears. This buff might be less meaningful in contexts with an especially large number of tokens, but when the deck only has a handful of tokens to swing in with, that size difference can be quite relevant to the outcome of the combat. As I alluded to earlier, this deck has 7 board wipes, which further enhance its combat potential. While the commander isn't likely to survive a wipe, the incubate tokens usually will, which can allow for a nice swing on a following turn. Or, I suppose the same turn if the deck has a lot of mana at that moment. Overall, this deck is a well-rounded mid-range deck based around a not very heavily played mechanic that goes excellently with Halsin. Love to see it. Alright, those were the winning decks. I appreciate everybody who participated, as even though it took a while to go through all the submissions, it's always super fun to see what people come up with. You can check out the honorable mentions in the link down in the description, and you can also feel free to let me know in the comments what you thought of these decks. What was your favorite? Was there a deck I didn't pick that you think was terribly robbed? You can also let me know if you have ideas for future deck building challenges, because these are fun, and I'll probably do 2 to 3 more later this year. With that said, thanks for watching, and thanks to my patrons for supporting my work on this channel. If you want to join them, a link to my Patreon is down in the description, and I greatly appreciate the generosity of all those who contribute. Alright, that's all for this one. Bye!